The distress beacon had been broadcasting for 11 days before anyone answered it. Sergeant Dara Voss heard it first, a thin, repeating pulse buried under 40 kilometers of Vethani interference, squeezed between the channel bands the collective used to coordinate their dispersal patterns. She almost flagged it as natural noise. The Vethani atmospheric processors generated static in dozens of frequencies. You learned to tune it out or you went insane, but something made her hold the signal. She ran the filter again, stripped back the harmonic layers, cleaned it down to the base transmission. It was a child's emergency transponder, Model VX4 standard issue in every outer colony's evac kit. Range 12 kilometers, battery life 10 days. The math was wrong in the worst possible way. That signal's been broadcasting longer than the battery should allow, said Corporal Tomas Brecht from behind her. He'd been eating from a pouch of rehydrated protein that smelled like boot leather, which was more or less what everything smelled like in the bunker after 12 months underground. I know, which means either the battery specs are outdated, or someone's been manually topping it off. Dara turned from the console. Someone alive. Brecht didn't say anything. He set down the pouch. The word alive had weight on Veth 7. It landed differently than it did anywhere else. On Veth 7, alive was the beginning of a sentence that usually ended badly, and you had to decide each time whether you were willing to keep reading to the end. Dara decided. She always decided the same way. We go get them, she said. The Vethani collective had arrived at the Outer Rim colonies 3 years ago. The colonists of Veth 7, a mining world of 40,000 souls, mostly ore drillers and their families, a few teachers, 3 doctors, a garrison of 46 soldiers, had watched the first ships come through the jump gate with the hollow wonder you bring to anything incomprehensible. They stood on their rooftops, they crowded their windows. Some took photographs. Some prayed, which was its own kind of photography, an attempt to record something too large to hold. It never made sense, not then, not after. The collective wasn't interested in conquest in any framework humans had built for understanding conquest. They didn't want territory. They didn't want resources. What they wanted was propagation, not in the reproductive sense that implied desire, but in the way a river wants the sea, inevitably, because that is what rivers do. Their biological imperative was stranger and more terrible than anything humanity's threat assessment models had accounted for. They carried a contagion, not a weapon exactly, not a disease in any clinical sense, but a transformation process, a rewriting so thorough it left nothing of the original except a few architectural echoes, the way a building sometimes leaves its footprint in the land after the structure is gone. Contact with Vethani dispersal spores meant becoming Vethani, not enslaved, not controlled, transformed down to the cellular level over the course of about 9 days. The nerve pathways stayed largely intact. The brain structure remained recognizable in scan, but the organizing principle changed, the animating will, the thing that pointed all that biology toward being a specific person with a specific name. The colonists called the transformed the turned. The brass in their distant orbiting stations used the clinical designation Vethani integrated, which had the virtue of precision, and the vice of being something you could say without feeling it. The soldiers on the ground called them the ash, because of what the transformation did to the skin, the grayish, desiccated, flaking texture that set in around day 3, spreading inward from wherever the spores had first made contact. Not painful, they thought. No one knew for certain. That was one of the many things no one knew for certain. There had been no cure. There had been no evacuation. The jump gate had been destroyed in the first 72 hours, whether by the collective deliberately or by the garrison attempting to prevent the spread of the ash from Veth 7 to any other world. Dara had never received a definitive answer and had stopped expecting one. The 46 soldiers became 31, then 20, then 17, then 9. The colonists, 40,000 of them became something else entirely over the following weeks. 9 soldiers, 12 months of living in a converted ore processing substation that the galaxy had apparently decided to pretend didn't exist. 11 days of a child's beacon singing in the static. "We go get them," Dara said. Brecht looked at her. He had the kind of face that had stopped trying to argue about things like this a long time ago, not because the arguments lacked merit, but because the arguments had never once changed anything she decided. "When do we move?" "Tomorrow night. I need to clean the signal enough to triangulate." "How many should we take?" She thought about it. "Everyone available 6. That leaves 3 in the bunker." "I know." She turned back to the console and started stripping the interference back, layer by layer, patient as she'd learned to be. "The 3 who stay will be fine. The 11, or however many there are, might not be if we send less." Brecht nodded once and went back to his boot leather protein. That was the nature of the conversation they'd been having for 12 months. Not agreement exactly, recognition. They went at night. Or what passed for night on Veth 7. The surface never went fully dark because the processing plants the Vethani had built in the first week still burned. Columns of pale blue-white light rising from 6 points around the original colony site, visible from 100 kilometers in every direction. They were beautiful if you let yourself look at them that way, which most of the soldiers had stopped doing around month 3. The ash moved more slowly after local midnight. Something in the Vethani transformation preserved certain circadian rhythms even after everything else was overwritten. Dara had documented this. She had documented everything, out of a conviction that documentation was a form of survival, that information outlasted individuals, that building a record was a way of insisting there would be someone to read it. Dara moved with Private Kel Aram on her left and Corporal Brecht on her right, 3 more soldiers spread in a loose arc behind them. The signal led northeast, toward what had been the colony's educational district, a cluster of low, functional buildings, the same gray-brown as everything else on Veth 7, designed by someone who prioritized practicality over aesthetics. A library, 2 schools, a community hall where people had held celebrations and council meetings and amateur theater productions that Dara had attended once, the one called The Miner's Wife, that had been surprisingly moving. The educational district was close to one of the processing columns. The ash congregated near the columns. No one fully understood why. The closest theory was that the columns served some organizational function for the Vethani network, a kind of chorus point, a gathering of signal that the ash were drawn to the way their organic predecessors had been drawn to warmth or sound. They moved through ruins that had been ordinary a year ago. Dara could still remember what the colony had looked like with people in it. She'd been stationed here for 8 months before the collective arrived, long enough to learn the names of the shopkeeper who sold her coffee every morning, a round-faced man called Evren who had an opinion about everything and shared it generously. Long enough to learn the mechanic who'd fixed her patrol vehicle twice and overcharged her both times, and then donated the overcharge to the school supply fund, which she found out about from the shopkeeper. Long enough to feel the specific texture of a place, the way each settlement developed its own personality from the accumulated choices of its people. Veth 7 had been a cheerful, pragmatic colony. Hardworking people who didn't complain about the cold or the ore dust, who organized festivals around the ore processing calendar, who had a tradition of painting their doors bright colors to offset the perpetual gray of the rock and sky. The doors were still painted. Yellow, red, green, orange, a few ambitious ones with painted patterns. They stood in rows along the empty streets, exactly as they'd been, because doors survive very well even when the people who chose their colors don't. Dara didn't let herself look at them too long. The signal strengthened as they entered the educational district. She hand-signaled a halt. Checked the reading, 50 meters northeast, in what the colony map identified as the Children's Learning Annex attached to the secondary school, a single-story wing. She remembered it, she'd walked past it a dozen times, never had reason to go in, occasionally heard children from behind its windows. The walls were reinforced. She checked her memory of the colony's structural records. It had doubled as an emergency shelter. Someone with knowledge of the colony's design had chosen that location deliberately. The choice was too good to be accidental. She signaled Aram forward, then followed him to the door. It was sealed from inside. Not welded, she checked for weld marks, found none. Sealed with a standard emergency bar, the kind any adult could operate, and with additional bracing that looked improvised. Lengths of pipe, desk legs, something that might have been a fire extinguisher bracket, all wedged at angles against the frame. Someone had been reinforcing this door not once but repeatedly, adjusting the bracing, adding new pieces. The marks showed it. Someone with limited tools and significant, sustained determination. She knocked. 3 times, pause, 3 more. The ash didn't knock. That was not the kind of behavioral subtlety the transformation preserved. Nothing for a long moment. Then from behind the door, a sound she couldn't immediately identify, a child moving, a careful repositioning, and then a voice, small and precise, speaking in the trade language Pigeon Common across the outer rim. How many? Brecht behind her made a sound that might have been a laugh under other circumstances. Dara pressed her hand flat against the door. 6 soldiers. All human. Say something a turned wouldn't say. She thought for a moment. My name is Sergeant Dara Voss. I've been underground for a year. The coffee in our bunker tastes like ground-up boots, and I would trade my left arm for a piece of actual bread. I've been listening to your signal for 11 days, and I couldn't sleep properly for any of them, thinking about whoever was keeping it going. I'm on the other side of this door, and I'm not leaving until I make sure you're all right. Silence. A longer silence than before, the kind where something is being decided rather than just considered. Then the sound of pipes being carefully removed, one by one. The systematic and patient sound of someone who had engineered this barricade thoughtfully and was undoing it the same way. There were 11 of them. 3 adults. Kala, who had been a teacher at the secondary school, a woman in her 40s with short gray-streaked hair and the particular posture of someone who has been holding herself upright through force of will for a very long time and knows that if she stops, she may not start again. Preem, who had been an ore technician, a quiet man with large hands that he kept busy whenever they weren't being deliberately still. And Rosset, the school's maintenance coordinator, an older man, 60s or near enough, who walked with a pronounced limp on his left side. He'd broken his ankle in the first week, and it had healed wrong without a doctor and without any real option to rest it. 8 children. The oldest was a 14-year-old boy named Sevet, broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had been doing physical work for too many of his 14 years, with dark eyes and a face that had settled into a seriousness that seemed structural, load-bearing, the kind of seriousness that holds other things up. He assessed the soldiers in the first 2 seconds with the practiced efficiency of someone who had learned to make assessments quickly. The other 7 ranged in age from about 5 to about 11, and they watched the soldiers from across the room with the particular alertness of children who have been frightened for a long time and have learned to process new things from a distance before deciding what to do about them. The youngest was the reason the signal had kept broadcasting past its battery life. She was maybe 5 or 6 years old. Kala said she wasn't certain, because the child had no documents and she didn't know her own birth date in the system Outer Rim colonists used. She had arrived at the annex 11 days into the collective's campaign. Kala described it in a flat voice, the way people describe things they've processed until the processing goes all the way down and comes out the other side as something that can be spoken without breaking. A woman had knocked. She had the child in her arms. By that point, Calla said, you learned fast what the ash looked like in early transformation, the gray spreading from the hands and neck, the particular quality of the eyes, still tracking, still purposeful but differently. She'd been ash, mostly, but she had knocked. She had stood at the door of the annex with a child in her arms and knocked in a way that meant, please. Calla opened the door. The woman handed the child through and then stepped back. Whatever clarity she'd been exercising, or whatever of her was still herself, the debatable boundary seemed to slip. Calla closed and rebarred the door. She never saw the woman again. The child was Ashborn. Not a term Dara used in official reporting. The designation there was the indigenous pre-colonial population of Veth7's southern continent. Ashborn were present in the colonial settlement as the children of integrated families, as workers who joined the colonial economy and stayed, as members of a community that had been two peoples long enough that the distinction had softened on all the ordinary days, which were most days. They were a smaller people than inner rim humans on average, heavier boned, built low to the ground for a cold world. Their skin carried a faint gray-green tint that deepened in cold, not the gray of the ash. A different gray, warmer, and the eyes were wide-set and amber-colored, with a larger aperture than human eyes. This child had amber eyes that saw everything and gave away nothing. Her name, Dara said to Calla, who was watching her assess the child. What's her name? Calla smiled. It was the first smile Dara had seen in 12 months that had anything simple in it. She told me, but she said she'd only tell her name to someone she decides she trusts. She has a system. The child's system worked like this. She would not tell you her name until you told her something true, something real, something you actually meant. She had, and Dara couldn't frame this in any technical language, only in the language of the fact, a way of knowing whether you meant it, whether the thing you said was the real thing. Calla said she'd tried once in the early days to say something comforting and untrue. She hadn't wanted to burden the child with honesty about their situation, and the child had known immediately, had simply looked at her, silent, with those amber eyes, and waited for the real thing. She doesn't tell me how she knows, Calla said. Ashborn perception, I've been reading about it in the library books, the ones that were in here already. They register frequencies we don't. Physiological stress responses, probably, but it feels like something more than that. Dara crouched down to the child's eye level. The amber eyes tracked her without blinking, measuring with the patience of something that has been waiting long enough to be patient about it. I'm going to try to take all of you somewhere safe, Dara said. I can't promise you I'll succeed. I've been wrong about things before and I'll be wrong again. But I'm going to try very hard, and I'm not going to stop trying, and I'm not going to pretend things are all right when they're not. The child was still for a long moment. My name is Myra, she said. They planned for 2 days in the annex. It was cramped. 11 civilians and 6 soldiers in a room designed for 30 children doing schoolwork, and the smell of too many people in a sealed space was familiar by now to Dara. Familiar and dulling in a way that made her aware again of the animal nature of survival, how it stripped things back to their essentials. The problem was simple in outline and complicated in every particular. 9 soldiers, 6 now, after Private Errol's accident during the return. 6 soldiers could move 11 civilians through 40 kilometers of ash-dense territory and reach the secondary bunker. On paper, this was tractable. In practice, the math required accounting for Rossett's limp, which limited pace to about 2/3 of normal, for 3 of the 8 children being under 7, which meant adult hands occupied with carrying or steadying, for the route northeast that would require passing close to 2 processing columns, and for the increasing unpredictability of ash movement patterns that Dara had been documenting for 12 months without being able to model reliably. On the second afternoon of planning, Myra came and sat at the edge of the group. She didn't announce herself. She just appeared there, and listened with the particular quality of attention that Dara was learning to recognize as this child's particular mode. Nothing performed, nothing demonstrative, just a complete and undefended presence. After the second session ended, she waited until the others had dispersed, then approached the map Dara had spread on a desk. She pointed at the route they'd plotted, which curved northeast to avoid the secondary processing column on the right flank. "Wrong," she said. Dara looked at her. "What's wrong about it?" Myra pointed at the cluster of ash positions near the secondary column. "They move at night, toward the column. They don't go past the column." She pointed at the perimeter strip between the column and the outer settlement wall, a narrow channel that Dara had marked as too exposed. "They stop at the light. They don't want to leave the light. So this place," she touched the strip, "it's empty at night. You can walk in it." Dara looked at the map. "You've been watching their movement patterns." "Every day, from the vent." She pointed at a ceiling access panel in the far corner of the room. "I count them. I know when they move. I know where they sleep." She said sleep in the careful way of someone using a word that is approximately right rather than precisely right, aware of the approximation. "How long have you been watching?" Dara asked. "Since the beginning." Sevet, who had silently materialized at Myra's elbow in the manner Dara was learning was his default, produced a notebook from inside his jacket. He set it on the desk without comment. The notebook was 3/4 full, pages covered in a child's handwriting, tight, systematic, organized by date and location, with a set of symbols that appeared to constitute a consistent notation system. Weeks of ash movement documentation, patrol timing, behavioral anomalies. The kind of intelligence record that a trained analyst would have been proud of. "She made me help her write it down," Sevet said. He was trying not to show how much this mattered to him. He was not entirely succeeding. Dara read the notebook for a long time. "Myra," she said finally, "this is the most useful thing anyone has given me in a year." Myra reached out and moved a tracing stylus across the map, adjusting the route in 3 places. "This way," she said. "This way is safer." They left on the 3rd night. Myra wore the transponder clipped to the front of her jacket, powered down now. The signal had done its work. The child moved close to Dara's left side, not clutching her, not reaching for her hand, just present in the way that said, "I have made a decision about this particular person, and I am acting accordingly." The route was Myra's route. Through the collapsed eastern wall of the school complex, where a section of old foundation had given way in the early weeks and left a gap large enough for a person to move through carefully. Then south along the processing plant perimeter, closer to the column than Dara liked, the light cold and constant on their left, the sound of the column, a subsonic vibration you felt in your chest rather than heard. Then northwest through the residential district, keeping to the shadow sides of buildings. The children were good. Dara had braced herself for noise, for fear, for the unpredictable behavior of exhausted children moving through a nightmare. What she found instead were children who had spent a year surviving in a school building and had developed their own discipline. Kala had organized them. Sevet had maintained the organization. Myra had contributed the essential ingredient of a detailed threat map and the calm of someone who has already been very frightened and has learned that fear is information rather than paralysis, that the useful question is always what you do with it. They moved for 90 minutes without incident. Then Private Arrow, on the rear guard, clicked his comm once, the signal for contact, and the world changed. 3 ash, coming from the south, which was not where ash should have been at this hour by any of Myra's documented patterns. Either the pattern had shifted in the last 2 days, or there was a variable the notebook hadn't captured. Dara counted exits in the time it took to breathe twice. Left, dead end, collapsed structure, no passage. Right, open ground, 200 meters to the next building, 2 exposed, 2 long, 3 small children who couldn't run that distance quietly. Ahead, The processing plant perimeter, the gap in the fence Preem had identified during their planning sessions. "Fence," she said, barely above silence. They ran. Civilian runs are different from soldier runs, slower, uneven, punctuated by the half-stumble of someone on uncertain ground in the dark. One of the younger children stumbled on broken paving, and Sevit caught her without losing stride, one arm sweeping out, the child back on her feet in a single motion that spoke of practice. He had done this before. Dara hit the fence panel, pried it back. Children through 1, 2, 3, 4, her own hands counting each passage. The ash were close enough now that she could hear the sound they made, not breathing exactly, a kind of sustained exhalation, the rhythm of it oddly musical, one of the specific and profound wrongnesses of the transformation that stayed with you. A person's last rhythms, looping. Children through, adults through, the last soldier through, Dara last. She pulled the fence panel back as close to its original position as she could manage. The dead zone, a gravel strip 15 meters wide between the outer fence and the column's radiation perimeter. Nothing grew here. Nothing was built here. The column's light fell across it vertically, cold and pale blue-white, and in that light the world looked like a photograph of itself, preserved and flat and very still. The three ash reached the fence. They stopped. She could see them in the column light, three of them standing at the fence line with the particular absolute stillness that was different from human stillness. Human stillness is an act of restraint, a muscle holding back movement. This was the stillness of something that had simply not received an instruction to move. In the cold light, their faces were visible. She didn't let herself look at the faces. The light held them. Myra had been right. The child was standing next to Dara, watching the three ash with the same measuring stillness she'd watched the soldiers with the first night. Not fear, Dara noted. Something beyond fear on the other side of it, a considered attention, a looking without flinching, that spoke of someone who had already looked at these things many times and arrived somewhere past the reflex. Then Myra reached up and took Dara's hand. Not in fear. The grip was too steady for fear, in the way that meant, I see them too, I know what they were, and I need you to know that I know. They stood in the column light, holding on. The three ash turned slowly without urgency and moved back south. Gone. Dara breathed out. They walked on. They lost Private Errol to building collapse in the third hour. Not to the ash, not to anything that bore a name in threat assessment. A building that had been structurally compromised by the vibration of the Vethani processors. She had known this neighborhood was risky, had factored it in, had thought she'd chosen the safer path through it. The western wall of a dwelling came down in a cascade of stone and old bonding material. An arrow was too far to the left, drifting left the way he'd been drifting all night. And she had noticed it and had not corrected it because there had been 14 other things to manage, and she would carry this. The rubble was too heavy. There was no sound from underneath it. There were children 5 meters away and three ash she could hear at the end of the block, and she couldn't let herself stop. She kept moving. She told the children it was a structural collapse and that they needed to keep walking. She did not tell them more. Sevit looked at her face and understood that there was more and asked nothing. Rosset put his hand briefly on her arm as he passed, just the weight of a hand for 1 second. Kala looked back at the rubble once and then looked forward. Myra turned her head back toward the collapsed building for a long moment, those amber eyes resting on the dark pile of stone. Then she turned and walked on. 6 soldiers now. Dara counted the feet, kept counting. The secondary bunker was a converted ore processing substation, buried into the hillside at the edge of the settlement's original footprint, 6 kilometers northeast of the colony center. The Vethani expansion had not yet reached this far, technically outside the exclusion perimeter as it had stood 18 months ago, when there had still been a perimeter that meant anything. The world had been reorganizing itself without consulting the maps. Private Una Marsh had the watch. She let them in through the secondary access hatch, her face moving through 4 or 5 expressions rapidly as she counted soldiers, civilians, children, and then stopping harder on the Ashborn girl who came in close behind Dara. 11, she said. 11, Dara confirmed. Una, blankets, water, and whatever food we have in the next 10 minutes. The other 6. Dara shook her head once. Marsh absorbed this the way soldiers learn to absorb this, not without cost, but without the cost showing in the short term. I'll start the kettle, she said, and went to do it. The bunker was not large enough for 17 people. It had been designed for 10 at maximum capacity, and had been feeling the strain with 9. 17 was a geometric problem. They solved it by converting the equipment storage bay into sleeping space, by moving the supply rotation to free shelving for bedding, by accepting that privacy was a concept that would have to live in memory for the foreseeable future. The children adapted with the flexibility that made Dara alternately hopeful and heartbroken. The ability to make 10 square meters of underground room feel like somewhere you could reasonably exist, that was a skill, a real skill, and no child should have to develop it. But children were extraordinarily good at it, better than adults in some ways, because children's sense of home was less architectural, less attached to specific configurations of space. Myra found a corner near the air circulation duct. She arranged herself with her back against the wall and the duct at her back, the one exit vector she could monitor from a sitting position. Old habit. All habits were old habits now. Corporal Brecht sat down next to her with 2 bowls of the rehydrated protein that constituted most of the bunker's caloric supply. He offered one. She looked at the bowl, looked at him, took it. Ate with the methodical focus of someone who understood food as fuel. You've been underground for a long time, he said. You have too, she said. He considered this. Fair point. He ate for a moment. The transponder idea, recharging it from the school's lighting circuit, that was yours. A small nod. How did you figure that out? There were books, she said. I read them. Dara, from across the room, caught Brecht's expression, the complicated admiration of a grown soldier for a small child who had thought of the thing they hadn't. She turned away so Myra wouldn't catch her looking. What happened next was the thing Dara had been deferring for a year. They had a long-range comm array, which the Vithani interference had suppressed in every frequency band she'd tried. They had 6 months of supplies if rationed carefully, less if they shared with 11 additional mouths. They had the movement documentation from Myra's notebook. They had the processing column perimeter map. They had 5 soldiers and a child who could feel the Vithani signal as a physical sensation. That last piece took 3 days to surface. It surfaced because Myra started drawing on the 4th day in the bunker. She found chalk. Someone had left a teaching slate in the equipment bay with a piece of chalk still in the tray, and she drew on the floor in her corner. Not pictures. Patterns. Some of them Dara recognized from the notebook, the notation system she and Sevet had developed for the ash movement maps, but others were different. Radial patterns, spreading webs, converging lines. She drew them carefully, returning to them, refining them. On the 6th day, Dara sat down next to her. Will you explain what these are? She asked, pointing to the ones she didn't recognize. Myra looked at her with the measuring expression. Then she pointed to one of the unfamiliar patterns, a web with a clear central convergence point, and said a word in Ashborn. I don't know that word, Dara said. It means, Myra paused, constructing the translation with visible effort. The place where something comes from, where it starts, the thing that makes it go. The source, the origin point. Origin, Myra tried the word. The ash have an origin, the columns. They are connected like roots. She traced the web pattern with one finger from the outer points toward the center, and the roots all go to the same place, one root at the center. How do you know this? She pressed one hand flat against her sternum. I feel it, here. She held eye contact steadily, making sure Dara understood she wasn't being poetic. Ashborn can. We feel the vibration. The columns make it. The place at the center makes it stronger. Dara kept her voice very neutral. If you had to point to where the center is. Myra picked up the chalk and drew a new pattern over the movement map, over the rough layout of the colony she'd been building from memory. She drew the web and she drew the center point, and the center point was located in the original colony square, beneath it, in the space that the colony's structural records would have called the subsurface utility network. I've always known where it is, Myra said. I thought everyone knew. It didn't occur to me to say it. Dara sat with this for a moment. Is that where the ash go, to that place? Around it, not inside it. They go around it like water goes around a rock. They don't go inside. She touched the center point with one finger. The inside is very quiet. The center is where the quiet is. Brecht, when Dara told him, was quiet for a long time. She can sense the Vethani command node, he said. Yes, consistent with everything we know about Ashborn sensory ranges. They register low-frequency vibration in ways human biology doesn't. It's documented in xenobiology archives. The columns must be broadcasting in a range she can feel physiologically. And she knows exactly where it is. She drew the map. Dara put the chalk diagram on the planning table. It's under the colony center, 6 levels down, based on the node's signal characteristics she described and what I know about how the Vethani build. If we disrupted it, we don't know what disruption would do. Disable the ash, reverse the transformation, kill them. We have no data. We'd be guessing. Brecht looked at the map for a long time. We have one data point. What? Myra's mother, he said it carefully. She came to the annex. She was ash, or becoming ash, and she still had enough of herself to carry a child to a door and knock on it. Something quieted the signal long enough for her to do that. Dara looked at the map. If the signal can be quieted locally, Brecht continued, it can probably be quieted globally, from the node. I'm not taking a child on an assault into enemy infrastructure. I know that. There's no version of this where that happens. I know that too. He spread his hands. What I'm asking is, what if Myra can tell us how to quiet it from out here? What if she can describe what her mother did? Myra, when asked, described it the way you describe a piece of music you heard once in childhood, from another room. You couldn't see the instrument, but you felt the vibration through the walls and you still carry the shape of it. Her mother had quieted the signal. Myra had felt it happen. Not a destruction, she was firm on this, in the careful way she was firm about anything she was certain of. Not a breaking, a stilling. The signal had been quieted from within by something that was still connected to it, still part of the network, choosing to turn its face away. She was still my mother, Myra said. Even then, even mostly ash. The part that was still her, she made it stop for a little while. Long enough. How did she make it stop? Dora asked. Myra pressed her hand against her chest again. She felt where it was. She reached out to it. She asked it to be quiet. A pause. The way you ask someone to stop doing something when you are still connected to them, when they still know you. Dara absorbed this. Could you do what she did? She asked. Not to a local signal, from the node itself if you were close to it. Could you ask it to be quiet the way she did? A long silence. Myra looked at her hands. I don't know, she said, with the honesty she applied to everything. I felt her do it. I know what it felt like from outside. I don't know if I can do what she did from inside. She looked up. But I don't think anyone else can. I think it has to be someone the signal recognizes. Someone it already knows. The Ashborn were here before the collective arrived, Dara said slowly. Yes, before everyone. This is our world. She said it without pride, just as a fact. The collective knows this. I don't know how, but they know it. The signal, when I am near it, it doesn't, she searched for the word, it doesn't push against me. It knows I belong here. They planned for a week. Dara ran every version of the plan she could construct, and in each version there was a component she couldn't substitute: proximity to the node and Myra. She built everything else around that unmovable fact. She used Myra's movement maps to identify the minimum coverage window, a 2-hour corridor around local midnight when the ash orbit patterns created a navigable gap along the route to the colony center. She cross-referenced with 12 months of her own observation logs. She ran the geometry twice, and then twice more. She did not tell Myra she was planning the mission. She did not need to. On the 5th day of planning, Myra appeared at her shoulder while she was at the console and looked at the maps for a moment. "I want to come," she said. "No," Dara said. "You can't feel the signal, I can. I have your maps." "The maps are from before, the signal moves." She pressed her hand to her chest again. "I always know where it is right now." "You need that." Dara didn't have an answer to this that wasn't her emotional response dressed up as tactical reasoning. She sat with it. "You're 6 years old," she said. 6 or 7, Myra corrected, "and I'm the one who kept 11 people alive for a year." She wasn't being proud about it. She said it the same way she said everything, as a fact to be considered. Brecht across the room said nothing. His face said, "She's not wrong." They left 2 nights later. 5 soldiers, 1 child, and Sevet, who Dara had attempted to leave in the bunker, and who had appeared at the access hatch in his jacket with his face set with the particular resolution of someone who has thought about this and made a final decision. "She goes nowhere without me," he said. This was not arguable in any practical sense. Dara let him come. 7 then. They moved along Myra's route, not the planned route exactly, because the signal had shifted slightly since the planning session and Myra updated for it in real time, touching Dara's arm to indicate turns, stopping to listen with her full body, her posture changing when she was reading something, then nodding them forward. It was the strangest form of tactical navigation Dara had experienced in 11 years of soldiering. She followed a small Ashborn girl through a dead colony at midnight, watching her feel the world through her sternum, and it was also the most effective navigation she'd ever known. The ash were there, dense around the colony center orbiting. But Myra knew where they were before they came into sight. She knew their positions from the signal, not from vision, and she threaded the group through gaps in the coverage that should not have existed by any movement model Dara had built, and did. They reached the colony center without contact. The node was 6 levels underground, accessible through a maintenance shaft the Vethani had cut when they built the processing complex over the original colony square. The colony's subterranean infrastructure was old. The settlement had been on Veth 7 for 80 years, and there were utility networks and transit tunnels from before the current generation of ore processing. The Vethani had found the existing voids and used them. Practical, Dara noted. Economical. They built over what was already there. The chamber at the end of the shaft was larger than she'd expected. Spherical, 10 meters across, the walls covered in a webbed pattern that she recognized from Myra's chalk drawings with a jolt of disorientation. The child had drawn this from sensation alone, had drawn the shape of a room she'd never been in. The node itself was in the center of the chamber, a translucent pale blue-white structure, about the size of a desk, roughly ovoid, pulsing with a slow light that fell outside human visual comfort ranges, not painful, but wrong in a way that was hard to articulate, like looking at a color that didn't have a name yet. Sevet stayed at the entrance to the shaft per Dara's instruction, not willingly. He stood in the opening with his arms crossed and watched. Myra stood at the chamber threshold and breathed. "It's loud," she said. "Does it hurt?" "Not hurt," she looked for the word, "like standing next to someone who is shouting, not hurting you, but loud." She breathed again, then she walked into the chamber. She circled the node slowly. Her hand came up and hovered near its surface without touching. The node's pulse changed, not a sound, not a visual change that Dara could clearly identify, but some quality of the air, some low-frequency shift in the pressure of the space. She felt it in her back teeth. "All of them," Myra said softly. "I can feel all of them, all the ash." She closed her eyes. "They were people." "They were," Dara said. "They're still in there." Very far in, very quiet. She was still completely still. "My mother is in there." A pause. "She's saying something." Dara didn't breathe. "She's saying to stop it. She doesn't want to stop existing. She doesn't want that. But she wants to stop." Myra's forehead creased as she searched for the frame for it. "She wants to stop what she's doing. She wants to stop being the thing that does what she's being made to do." Her eyes opened. "She wants to come home." There was nothing to say to that. Dara said nothing. Myra placed both hands on the node. 4 minutes and 11 seconds, by Dara's count. Myra stood with both hands flat on the node's surface, and was more still than Dara had seen any living thing be. Not the stillness of concentration. The stillness of being entirely elsewhere, of having sent most of yourself somewhere and left only enough here to keep standing. The node's pulse shifted from its slow, regular pattern to something faster, a rhythmic, stuttering. The web pattern on the walls began to dim, not all at once, from the outer edges inward, the way a fire dims, drawing back toward its center before going out. From the surface above, filtering down through 6 levels of stone and old utility conduit, a sound, not an explosion, not a structural sound, the sound of very many things simultaneously exhaling, one long shared breath, and then silence of a different quality than the silence before. Myra stepped back from the node. She looked at her hands for a moment, then at Dara. "It's quiet now," she said. "Is it done?" "Not done." She was certain about this, that particular certainty. "I asked it to stop like she did. It stopped." She looked at the node, which still pulsed but differently, slower, smaller, the blue-white light pulling inward. "It will stay stopped for a long time. I don't know how long, but long." Dara looked at the node, then at the child. "We need to go," she said. On the surface, the ash were still. Not gone. They were still there, still on the streets, still occupying the doorways and the perimeters of the processing plants. But the quality of their presence had changed. The purposeful, coordinated quality, the quality of something that has instructions and is carrying them out, was absent. They stood with the specific lostness of things waiting for a signal that is not coming, not moving toward anything, not moving away from anything. Dara walked through them. She walked through them with Myra at her left side and Sevet at her right, and 4 soldiers spread around them. And the ash stood still and did not track them, did not orient, did not follow. She walked through them the way you walk through a crowd that doesn't know you're there, and it was the most surreal and most terrible and most extraordinary thing she had ever done in her life. One of the ash turned its head as they passed. A woman. The transformation was advanced, months of it. The architecture of a face changed in ways that took her a moment to read as still a face. But the eyes. The eyes were doing something that Dara could not name and would spend a long time trying to name and never quite manage. Not awareness, exactly. Not recognition. Something below recognition. Some deep structure thing that the transformation had not reached. Myra looked at the woman as they passed. She said 2 words in Ashborn quietly, without stopping walking. They kept walking. They were 3 kilometers from the bunker when Sevet, who had been walking with the methodical focus of someone who is not allowing themselves to feel things yet, said, "What did you say to her?" "To who?" Myra asked. "The ash woman, when we passed her." A silence. Myra watched her feet on the uneven ground for a few steps. "I said we're coming back," she said, "so she knows." Sevet was quiet. "Then you think she heard you?" Myra considered this honestly. "I don't know, I said it anyway." Back in the bunker, Calla met them at the hatch. She looked at each of them, Dara, Sevet, Myra, the soldiers, counting, and then stopping counting and just looking at the child, who came in last and stood in the entry corridor still smelling of the cold outside. "Did it work?" Calla asked. "Something changed," Dara said. "We'll know in a day or two." She looked at Myra. "You should eat something." "Yes," Myra agreed. On the second day after, the ash began to move. Not the directed, purposeful movement of the previous months, not the orbiting of columns, not the systematic sweeping of corridors. Random movement. Dispersal, gradually, from the denser concentrations around the colony center outward. The processing column output readings, which Dara had been tracking for 12 months, dropped by 60% over 12 hours, then fell another 40 before the end of the second day. On the fourth day, the second column went dark. On the sixth day, Private Marsh picked up a signal on the long-range array. Military tight beam. Compressed. Encrypted with a code Dara had been carrying for a year and had, over the last several months, come close to deciding she would never use. She sat in front of the console for a long moment after the decryption resolved. Rescue incoming, 48 hours. She sat there for a while longer. Then she told Myra first. The child was in her corner, not drawing, just sitting. She did that sometimes, not doing anything, not watching anything particular, just occupying a space with her whole presence. "There are ships coming," Dara said. "In 2 days they'll take us somewhere else." "Will you be on them?" "Yes." "And Calla, Brecht, Sevet." "All of them." "Will it be far?" "Fairly far, but you'll be able to see from the viewport. You'll see the stars." Myra had never been off-planet. This was visible in her expression, in the careful management of something that wanted to show more than she was ready to let it. "Will I be able to come back? Someday?" Dara paused. "I don't know when, but someday I think yes." "I want to come back," Myra said. "This is where she is, even quiet." "This is where she is." "I know. I want her to know we didn't leave and forget." "She knows," Dara said. She meant it, and she didn't know if it was true, and she said it anyway. Some truths require the saying first. Myra picked up her chalk and drew something new in the center of her web pattern on the floor. A small circular mark, a convergence point. In the Ashborn symbolic tradition that Calla had been teaching herself from the books in the annex, this mark meant a place that is held in the mind of someone who loves it. A place that is kept. The ships descended through cloud cover in the gray dawn, 3 of them, larger than anything that had landed on Veth 7 in 3 years. The children watched from the topside hatch, all 8 of them in a row against the cold wind, watching the ships come down. Sevet stood next to Myra. He'd been standing next to her for a year. It was his default geography. The ramp opened. An officer came down, young, with the specific quality of someone who has been briefed but not experienced, who knows the facts but not the weight of them. She looked at the survivors, at the soldiers, at the civilians, at the Ashborn girl who came down the line holding Dara's hand, not gripping, just holding steadily. "How many survivors?" the officer asked. 16, Dara said. She didn't adjust the count. Arrel was one of the 16. He would stay one of the 16. The officer looked at her tablet. "Records show a garrison of 46. Records are a year old." The officer absorbed this. She looked at the colony behind them, the silent buildings, the 3 remaining processing columns still burning, the colony square with its painted doors, all those choices of color, all that evidence of people who had expected to be here long enough to decide what their doors should look like. What happened down here? Dara looked at the colony, at Myra, who was looking at the colony too, with those amber eyes, steady and wide. "People held on," Dara said, "any way they could find." On the ship in the first hour, Myra sat at the viewport and watched. Veth 7 below them, growing smaller. The 3 remaining processing columns, visible from orbit as pale points. The spread of the southern continent, gray-green, old. The land where the Ashborn had lived for 10,000 generations before anyone from elsewhere had known to find it. The colony site, a small scar of settlement in the wider stone. All of it becoming smaller, the size of a coin, the size of a thumbnail, the size of something you could cup in both hands. Dara sat next to her. For a long time, neither of them said anything. The ship hummed. Somewhere behind them, Kala was organizing the children. She had not stopped organizing the children and probably would not stop for some time. Sevet was eating something with the focused application of someone who hasn't eaten properly in a year and intends to correct this. Brecht was asleep in the corridor, simply asleep, as if the decision to sleep had been an executive one that he'd made and executed without ceremony. It's very big, Myra said. She meant space, the dark between things. It is, Dara agreed. But there are things in it, not empty. Lots of things, we're still finding them. People. Some of them. Myra leaned forward slightly, looking down at the planet through the viewport glass. I told her, she said. We're coming back, she knows. Yes, Dara said. Myra pressed one hand flat against the viewport. The planet below her, the size of something holdable. She had kept a signal alive for 11 days longer than the battery should have allowed. She had kept 11 people alive in a school building for a year. She had walked into a chamber at the center of an alien command network and asked it to be quiet, because it recognized her, because she had always been here, because this was her world and she knew it in her bones, and in the frequency she felt in her chest, the deep recognizing vibration of home. She had done all of this and she was 6 or 7 years old, and she had never been called a soldier or a savior or a hero, and she did not want to be called these things. She wanted to be called by her name. She wanted to be called home. Dara's arm came around her, not asked for, not requested, offered. Myra didn't move away from it. The ship moved through the dark. The planet below became a point of light among other points of light, and then one point among many, and then simply the direction you would go if you were going back, the direction she would always know. The silence between them was the silence of people who have been somewhere together, the silence that doesn't need to be explained, the silence that means, I know what you survived, I know your name, you told it to me and I'll keep it. Don't call me your majesty. Just call me home,